record to this.
Okay,
Right.
great. Yay.
Well, Winnie Dasilva, it is a very big privilege and tremendous joy to be able to have you on our Lead Integrity podcast and to learn from you some of your wisdom about women's leadership, leadership in general, and some of the things that we're facing in a very crazy world, it would seem. So, Winnie, without rather than me introduce you, can I please ask you to introduce yourself?
Of course. Yes, of course. Yes. First of all, I was just telling you a minute ago that I'm just so humbled and honored to be on your podcast among so many stellar guests that you've had before. And I said that I don't feel like I'm your typical guest, but you said there's no typical guest, so I guess that's okay. And I just want to, say that it's just an honor to be here with you talking about such important things that impact all of us. What's going on in the world, and that could be if you're someone more in your world in terms of, global interface faith leadership, but also in a lot of other people's world around business. It's all kind of the same in some ways, what leadership is and should look like. But anyway, a little bit about me. I actually started my whole career, started as a social worker. So I have a master's degree in social work from Columbia University here in New York City, and did that for a couple of years. Actually worked for a couple of Christian not-for-profits here in the city. Yep. And then quickly pivoted to business consulting, which seemed like a really interesting and different and big jump. But it was really a great fit for me. I never would have really have imagined myself there, but worked for Arthur Andersen Business Consulting in their change management practice until they died. And then after that, one of the clients that I worked with when I was at Arthur Andersen, they were looking for a head of learning development. And since I already knew the CEO, having worked with him when I was at Andersen, I was able to get that job and was their head of learning development for 3 years, and then left because I had a baby and felt like I couldn't work in the same way they were asking me to work. Um, Interviewed for a couple of jobs, ended up turning down all of them and quitting my job and literally jumping off the cliff to starting my own business, which I've now done for 20 years, last October. And what I do, what I've done and do now in these last many years is I do four things. So I do executive coaching, I do leadership development, so leadership training, I do team development work, and then I have my own podcast, Transformative Leadership Conversations, just talking about all things leadership. So that's a little bit about me.
Remarkable, remarkable, remarkable. So you're the quintessential person actually that should be on our podcast as a matter of course. So it's not about being out of the ordinary. It's actually, this is it. This is exactly the kind of experience where, you start in Christian led entities, you transition to the consultancy space and the management space,
Yeah.
and you then develop your own business. And congratulations, 20 years is a remarkable milestone. May you continue to flourish.
Thank you.
Given that very rich history of engaging, consulting, advising, leading, what are some of the things you've noticed and picked up along the way that you're
Mhm.
comfortable sharing
Mhm.
on aspects of being leadership and being a
Mhm.
woman? And you said you had to transition when you were pregnant and you realized you needed to have a different rhythm in your own life. Tell us some of the things
Yeah.
you've picked up along the way, please, Winnie.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, I think one thing, and it's always easy to talk about this looking back. When you're always in the middle of it, it's different, right? But looking back, I think one of the things that really, really came to me that was helpful for me, but I also talk to my clients about is really being clear on what it is that you want, and going for things, even if you're not quote unquote qualified. even if it feels like, wow, this is crazy. Like, who else is doing this? I don't know. And I think just sort of really having clarity for yourself, even if you don't know all the answers and you feel scared and you feel like, wow, this is big, to just do it anyway. And that doesn't mean you don't do it forever, right? It means you try things out. Like when I started my business, I was like, let me try this for a couple of months. I mean, I wasn't like, I'm going to now do this for the rest of my life. It was like, right now, I need some flexibility. And of course, back then, it's interesting, before virtual work, before the pandemic, before like all the flexibility, which is now kind of ebbing away a bit. But before all that, like I was trying to convince my employer to let me, work from home one a couple of days a week. I tried the same thing with all these people I was interviewing. Nope, nope, nope. And so what was interesting is that and my first client was actually my old employer. So it was sort of weird because I got what I want in the end, but my point is that, as a woman, there's lots of things that you can kind of put on yourself and even as a person, like even men or women put on yourself in terms of like a lot of shoulds, and a lot of like, well, what is everyone else doing? And it's kind of like, sometimes you need to just step out of that and kind of try, again, like I said, try doing something that you feel like is going to be good for you. And again, it doesn't have to be forever, but I say that about myself, but I also I'll have a lot of conversations like this, Azo, with the people that I work with. Again, men and women, but women in particular, I think have a lot of, shoulds on them. And they also, have a lot of, um, emotional sort of wrestling with their role and who they are and who they want to become. And it feels like in the world out there, there's a lot of like, almost like cookie cutter, black and white kind of images that we have in our head. And I guess what I feel like I always try to help my clients with is really, again, getting clear on what do you want, and also, if you don't totally know what you want, trying experiments, trying some things out. So I don't know. I don't know if that answers your question, but those are some thoughts.
I mean, I like the fact that you speak about taking a leap of faith almost. When you
Yes,
decide you're going to try for something that you're not 100% sure you can do, um, but you take that leap of faith and figure things out as you go along. And I think um, obviously not all of us have that option.
that's right.
In
That's right.
fact, you're right. In fact, many have
Don't.
to work because they need the resources to complement or even to just have an income in their own homes. And we know that two-thirds of households around the world are actually women headed.
That's
So
right.
that opportunity to to experiment may not even
Yeah.
be available to frankly the majority of people, men and women, as you
Yes.
highlight. But amongst those that may have that option, I think what you've said underlines um, how important it is to keep trying, to just
Yes.
try. And I think that's something it's a lesson that most of us hear as we're growing up. You have to try, at least try,
Yeah.
and see what
Yeah.
happens, and so on. I'm wondering when you hear things like being faithful, faith inspired, or whatever, what comes to your mind, Winnie, given the realms you work in, the spaces you've been working in all your lives and interacting with? What are the things that come to your mind when you think of the word faith inspired?
It's interesting. I don't really outwardly at work live in that space. I don't. And as it relates to faith as we traditionally think about it, right? I sort of have, my own beliefs that really are my core beliefs and core values that are core drivers for me in the work that I do. And while it may not seem to maybe the rest of the world that that's a faith, thing, usually it is for me. But I think that, it's interesting. So maybe we can come back to that. But it's interesting what you say about choice, right? And you're absolutely right. When we zoom out and we look at the world and we're thinking about what choices do people, have to experiment and to try things. It's interesting because in some ways I see some of the risk takers, as people that you don't expect, the immigrants, who come to our country, who are like, well, first of all, who just came to our country, right? And all that they risked potentially. I mean, certainly some are escaping something, right? And so they're hoping for a better life. But even some people who have it decent, in another country and are still coming here and potentially, they were working as a PhD engineer in their country and now they're, driving a cab so that, their kids can have a better education. So in some ways, I feel like the risk takers are people that you don't traditionally expect. They have a lot to lose. And yet a lot of the people, not everybody, but there's people that I work with who are kind of quintessential credentialed high salary, high industry people, and they think they don't have choices. So, anyway, it's just interesting when we think about choice and we think about what's really available, and who are the people that are making some of those risky choices.
So let's delve into that a little bit more because I think we do
Sure.
tend to find um especially when you come from or you've been socialized in contexts where there's, as you were saying earlier, there's a lot of shoulds on your shoulder. You should
Yeah.
this, you should this, you shouldn't that, whatever. Within those contexts, Winnie, I think there's a sense, one could say, there's a sense where ha even having a choice may seem like a luxury, and yet
Yeah.
I hear you saying, well, do we actually know whether, I mean, do we do have a choice? Perhaps we do have a choice and we're not aware of it. Do you want to maybe share a little bit of your own experience in working with especially women in leadership spaces who may not realize that they have choices that they are able to
Yeah.
make? Can you perhaps
Yeah.
share a little bit of your own experience working in that kind of a with those kinds of women and how you've explored together, how you help them explore, or how you help understand the understanding or the awareness that there is a choice.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think for women in particular, again, there's a lot of emotional and cognitive load that they're dealing with, whether it's because they're the primary financial earners in their family or they're the only financial earners in their family. They're a single parent, even in the best case scenarios, honestly, a lot of the emotional labor in a household falls on women. And so while they're managing a lot of things, sort of the last thing that they may be thinking about is, what are the choices that I have in my career? Like, I've got a really good job. It pays well. I might not like it, but, why am I gonna like, buck up against that and try to figure out something that, maybe I love, that still fits. Maybe it doesn't have the same perks or it doesn't have the same pay. So I think in some ways, kind of at any level, women many times will struggle with really taking the time, and that's a big part, a big chunk of it is taking the time to actually think. That's a luxury for a lot of us, is literally just time to think and time to reflect on, again, what I kind of talked about earlier is what do I want? And we don't often have the luxury of asking ourselves that. So I think it starts there. And in some ways, the work sometimes in coaching that I do with women, but also men, is thinking about giving them that time, and that ability to kind of think together about what it is that they want. Um, and really getting some clarity there. Again, like I'm not like a career coach. That's not my primary, work. But in some ways, what happens is I always want women in particular to know and realize that they have a choice. Again, mostly the women I work with, they do. I'm working with like privileged women, really, right? Who do have choices. And anyway, so I think that that's a big part of it is just the time to think, the time to like step out of like the craziness of their lives and to think about what is it that I want and how do I even start to think and pursue that. Um, and then honestly, like I'll take it one step further is really tapping into your community. You can call that community whatever you want, your network, your friends, your colleagues, the people you went to school with, like And I think that's where in today's world we're kind of isolated as you know, we're isolated more than we have been in the past from those communities. And I think that's where we can, because it's not just me helping them, like that one-on-one, I mean, that's limited, right? But when you can really tap into the communities that you're a part of, or you have been, and revitalize them, right? That's when true choices can come alive because you're engaging, right? And you're saying, hey, I'm not sure. What do you think? Or I'm looking for, right? And then all of a sudden, your whole network and your whole community becomes alive in, well, what about this? And what about that? And so I think that those communities play a huge role.
Definitely. And of course, these communities vary from place to place and context to context. I recall that especially when we compare, North and South or East or West, there is always a critique that sort of Western societies have become much more individualized and atomized, and that the traditional support structures that women could rely on or can rely on in say Eastern societies of family and whatever, which are usually much more, you know, lots bigger,
Yes.
that these support structures don't tend to be obviously available or available in the same ways in northern or western societies. And so your point about, well, you still have communities to tap into is actually a really valuable point, because we tend to see things in either black or white. Either you've got a support structure or you don't. And obviously things are a lot more complicated than that. But is it not interesting that in this day and age we are now talking about the value of having a community, identifying, finding it, learning how to rely on it? What are some of the things that you would normally sort of advise your people or your clients about? Like, how do you know what your community? How can you identify them? Who is your community? And I think that applies. That question should apply in normal context, but have you had an experience where this is something that you would need to advise migrant women
Hmm.
on
Hmm.
or about, who are also in the business sector? If you've had that experience, maybe just share a little bit with us what it's like with the sort of the traditional, for lack of a better word, the more privileged women you deal with, but also if you've had that experience of helping to find and identify community with those who are incoming without necessarily having been rooted in this original structures.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I'm going to answer this question in a totally different kind of way, but it still applies because, I'll go back to my experience when I made that big career shift. So I moved from New York City, having been a social worker, working with kids in the South Bronx who were crack kids and their grandmothers who were taking care of them, like, really different circumstances. Moved back to Chicago, in the suburbs of Chicago. And I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was like, I don't know what I want to do. I don't think it's social work, but I don't know. And I just started doing these informational interviews. And I just started talking to the people that I did know there, who I still were in contact with, and just started talking to people and just saying, well, I think I want to do this. I think I want to do that, and just started interviewing people. And then in those informational interviews, what I do is I ask people, if it was a good conversation, are there one or two other people that you think I should talk to? Now, what happened is that I organically grew my network in ways that I wouldn't have been able to do by myself. Like, I didn't know any of those people, and the people they introduced me, I didn't know them, they knew them, right? So figuring out how to organically grow your network, because, I think to your point, like if I went to, Harvard, business school, which a lot of my clients have, it feels like there's a pretty good natural, network there, right? But if you didn't, and you're switching careers, or you're a woman or a man coming from a different country who are kind of trying to figure out how to figure out the job market here and what they want to do or anything, how can you then tap into what the little that you do have and the little that you do know and grow that network organically? I mean, it's certainly a lot easier to do that nowadays in the age of LinkedIn. I've been on both sides of it, where just reaching out to people on LinkedIn and saying, hey, you've done some really interesting things in your career. Can I just talk to you for 20 minutes? That's a low ask, right? That's a low bar, right? And most people will say yes because most people like to talk about themselves. You know what I mean? And so that's really, I think, a way that you can do it. Now, you have to have some courage. You have to kind of just try, again, try, right? Do this a couple of times and see where you get. But I think there is a way that you can organically grow your network.
It's interesting that you would say that because I think that does indeed show how just taking the initiative to ask the folks around you or to reach out to the people that you're on social LinkedIn on social media to and just ask the question. And it kind of goes is very much in line with what you said, which is try. You got to try.
Yeah.
And so this is pretty much the extension of that is just ask.
Yes.
And the worst that can happen is that people will not be able to help or will turn away and just not want to help. But that's okay because you just keep trying and just asking the questions. I think what often comes back to me as a response is, well, am I asking the right question?
Yeah.
The right people? And I think that's I do think that stands to reason as a pretty good question to ask. Like, who do you know?
Yep.
Do you know whom to ask what kind of question to? But it's something also that comes with practice, I presume. The more people you know, the more you can ask, the more they can direct you. Some people will direct you to who else is better suited to ask those
Yeah.
questions of or whatever. Maybe just moving to your learnings from over those 20 years of working to support clients in this space. Have you noticed any particular differences between male leaders or women leaders, or in terms of how they each seek to enhance their leadership? Have you noticed any particular differences?
One difference that always sort of stands out to me is, and it's really well documented. In fact, I'm sure that you could probably code it better than I do, but this whole idea of, if there's a job and men are like, maybe I'm going to make up a number, but like 30% qualified, they will raise their hand and say, I can do that job. Women could be 90% qualified, but that 10% is holding them back from raising their hand and saying, I can do that job. For some reason, I didn't get that gene and I raised my hand at 30%. And in fact, women have actually said to me, wow, that's really different. So that's something that I notice, and I see it in my clients, because again, they're holding themselves back, and I'm thinking to myself, you have done this, you've just done it over here. Maybe you haven't done it quite like that, right? But you have done this. Or I feel like you are interested enough and have the skills that you could quickly get up to speed on that, right? So I think that's one thing that I have definitely seen happen, and studies show that this is a real thing, and that is something that, again, I use the word try. The new word that I like to use is experiment. I don't know if you've read Tiny Experiments. Shoot, I can't remember the author. I have her book right here. Here we go. Tiny Experiments, an amazing book, really good. Okay. Now, that I think why I love the book and why I love this idea of experiments is because if you feel like, wow, I'm not sure I can do this job, or should I raise my hand? It's almost like try, just experiment with it, see what happens, right? Maybe if you feel better, talk to people. Like, hey, what do you think about this? Do you think that this is something that, I could do? Maybe it's a mentor, right? Maybe it's someone like that you can say, hey, I'm thinking about making this move. Give me some feedback. What do you think about that? But anyway, I think that's one big thing that I've noticed between men and women.
That's a really, and I love the way, and thank you so much for the book. I have not read it, and I certainly look forward to it.
Yeah.
Really on a slightly different track, and I think
Yep.
most of us are born with the gene that says if you don't feel like you're 110% qualified, don't go for it. Um,
Right.
whereas indeed, I think the leap of faith is one that says, well, for heaven's sake, try, and
Yeah.
just try, and see what happens and apply anyway. What about situations or circumstances, Winnie, where a lot of women and men will tell you, look, if the overall environment, and I think this particularly applies now where there's so much resistance to diversity and inclusion and whatever and equity, if the
That's
environment
right.
is so discriminatory,
Yes.
if new forms of patriarchy or even misogyny seem to be more predominant, um,
Yes.
what is what are the ways to enable, to empower, to suggest, to encourage? Because it's obviously, even if you do have that willingness to take the leap of faith, things are a lot more difficult. Discrimination is a great deal more rampant. Nastiness is more
Agree.
normal and usual. Um, what do you say to
Yeah.
women in this context, or men even,
Yeah.
who are trying to be good leaders and apply for opportunities in the midst of so much discrimination and unfavorable circumstances?
Yeah, and I'm just going to recognize that that question is just really hard, right? I mean, we're really in a very unique and very challenging moment for most, uh, people who are not maybe white males. And so that's like a really hard question. In my little slice of the world, where what I start to think about is and actually, I kind of noticed that women, when they advocate for themselves, sometimes this doesn't always happen, but sometimes when they advocate for themselves, they're kind of talking about themselves rather than the value that they can bring. So what do I mean by that? When like I have someone that I've worked with on and off for the last couple of years, and she's trying to get her boss to see her as someone who can do more. Okay. And they've had these conversations back and forth. It's not anything new. Her boss, who is a male, is reluctant to let go of things. And there's probably a lot of reasons for that. I don't think it's because she's necessarily a woman. I don't think that that's probably the primary driver. But when she advocates for herself with him, she's kind of talking about like, I want to be able to do this. There's these are the things that I think I can do, right? Versus it's a slight difference versus if you let me do this, this is the value that I can bring to you in the business.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I think that constantly thinking about what does that person care about? How can I frame everything that I want? Because it's good to, again, like I was saying before, it's good to understand what you want, but then you have to like translate that and transform that into what do you want? And what's good for me is good for you.
Right.
And by the way, if you let me do what I want to do, the value that I'm going to bring, I can articulate that. Here it is, right? Or I can show it to you. Let me try, right? Again, let me try this piece. And I'll give you an example from my life. So when I went to Arthur Andersen Business Consulting, I didn't automatically, I wasn't a consultant. I was a training coordinator. Then I was a training director. And actually, I wouldn't recommend this for most people, but 6 months into the job at Arthur Andersen, my first, when I was a training coordinator, I looked around and saw what they were doing. And I said to my boss, who was like the recruiting person, there, I said to her, you know what? I want to be a consultant. And she basically was like, looked at me like I was crazy. And she's like, you have to have a master's degree in change management. And I'm thinking, well, I have a master's degree in social work, right? Well, I basically, long story short, I ended up infiltrating myself into that practice and asked them if I could do some projects. So I was literally doing two jobs at the same time. I was doing the job I was supposed to be doing, and then they let me do some other work with clients because, hey, I was a free resource, right? So that kind of thing where it's like, you know what? It's not just about what I want and talking about the value I can bring. It's showing, but it's also framing
Mm-hmm.
what I'm doing. It's actually going to help you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a very important piece of strategic wisdom. How do you frame your value in a way that corresponds with what the person, the institute, the entity is actually looking for?
That's right.
Whereas, and your value is also what you want to do. So how do
Yes.
you frame it in such a way that it actually corresponds to precisely what the ask is from
That's
that
right.
particular source. And
Because it's not about you doing me any favors.
right.
Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't want to be positioned myself as like, oh, I'm being nice or I'm doing it for a DEI initiative, which would be nice. But, at the end of the day, like, I want to show you that actually this is good for you in the business, right? And I think that that's really a different kind of ask than like, do me a favor and do it for me. You know what I mean?
Yes. Yes. To nuance it a little bit more,
Good.
as let's say you think you are putting it in those terms, but the listener may not necessarily get that. So
Yeah.
what are the strategies you would suggest to be more competent in framing or reframing in such a way? Are
Yes.
there any particular strategies that you advise people to do? And of course, I realize that we're asking you for your wisdom without paying you anything for it, but
Oh,
whatever you care to
no,
share.
I love it. I love giving stuff away for free. I really do. No, I'm good with that. I'm good with that. Okay, I'm going to tell you a secret weapon.
Yes, go for it. Lovely. We got a scoop, folks. We got a scoop. Yes.
Okay, good, 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 good. So this is I think a game changer for so many different levels. Asking really good open-ended questions.
Hmm, hmm,
It's
hmm,
as simple as that.
hmm,
So asking open-ended questions, okay, first of all, gives you an opportunity to gather data
hmm.
because you will never know what people really care about or what's good for the business or anything else until you have good data behind it, right?
Right, right.
And you can go in with an assumption, right? Based on what you kind of know or based on what you read about. I mean, those are all good things to do, right? But asking good open-ended questions about what does that person care about? How do they see the business? First of all, honestly, Aza, just in the act of asking those questions, you're going to look smart. You're going to look like someone who's curious, which is super important. You're going to look like someone who cares about them. You're going to look like someone who cares about the business,
Hmm,
right?
hmm,
So already you're on top, right? And then you're gathering data. And now in that moment, you might not frame what it is that you want based on, their value or what the value you could bring. But that's the good starting point. And then you step back and you think, okay, what did that person say to me? What data did I gather? What is this telling me? Who else can I talk to, by the way, who knows my boss, knows how they are, right? Knows what they care about, because maybe I don't know him as well as maybe I'd like to or whatever. I don't know him I know him in one context, but not in other contexts, right? So asking really good questions and gathering data is the first big part of that. And then kind of thinking about now, how do I connect the dots and connect what I know and what they've said to what I want, right? To again, the value that I can bring and frame it in the words that they gave me,
hmm,
right?
hmm.
Use the same words and language and content to frame it that way.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. Thank you. That is superb strategic advice, and we got it for free. What a
Yeah.
scoop. Thank you. Thank you, Winnie.
Yeah.
I think, if I may, I'd like to ask you also just what happens if you find yourself um, trying to appeal to people who have very different political views, because this
Mhm.
is the era we live in right now where there's such political polarization. And you may not know, but I mean, we kind of always take a risk when we're getting involved in any conversation, and when we're going for a job interview, or when we're trying to um, present what we can give to people and different institutions. But the
Yeah.
situation is so polarized. And so, do you have any advice for contexts like today's in which there is such a polarization? There's a lot of uncertainty about the people that you're dealing with. Where do they stand on so many issues that may be very important to you, that may even be issues on which votes are decided, right? So, given that kind of a context, do you have any specific experiences and or wisdom that you've noticed? And it doesn't have to be advice that you would give, but things that you've noticed in your own career over
Yeah.
time with this increased polarization.
Yeah. I mean, I think that depending on who you are, your work situation, um, maybe what risks you're managing, right? I mean, there's a lot of considerations to put into view. Um, my goal in work situations and in personal situations is to figure out how can I connect with this person because there's got to be something that we have in common. There's got to be something that we agree on, even if it's that, you know, we love our mothers or whatever, you know what I mean? And I think that, really bringing humanity to each other and knowing and almost like I guess one of the assumptions that I always have try to have about people is I don't know their whole story. You know what I mean? And where they are today, they may have done a lot of work to get to where they are right now. And even if they're pretty still difficult or whatever, they may have done a lot of work to get to this point and they were, maybe worse before. Or you don't know what that person has been through, right? And considering what they've been through, they're doing pretty good. And so that's what I always try to think about is how can I tap into the humanity of that person and connect with that person on that level? Because that's, I think, the magic, that we all need to have right now in this world, because it's so easy to get polarized when we're on screens or we're on social media. You
Yeah.
know what I mean?
Yes.
But when we're talking face to face and we're in the work environment, it's like there is an opportunity to get underneath that, even if, you're talking about someone who seems pretty X, right?
Right.
Whatever that X is, right?
Right.
So anyway, I don't know. That's what I try to do is think about their humanity and how can I connect to it.
Brilliant. Thank you. As we come up to sort of the last few minutes we have together, I just wanted to
Yeah.
ask you if there was any particular question or issue that you wanted to seize the opportunity to talk to speak to um, in the business of consulting and leadership and management and so on. Is there anything you really want to leave our listeners thinking about?
Mhm. Um, you mean in terms of like in what aspect? In terms of like,
Just the lessons learned, the experiences, the wisdom that you would want to give to aspiring young leaders, thinking of the ones you yourselves are cultivating, and like
yeah.
what advice would you want to give? What thoughts would you want them to reflect on? Um, and even just even older people, like what are some of the things you would say, I really wish I had the chance to share with you a few of these reflections? What would they be?
Yeah. One of the things that I think about a lot, partly because of the work that I do, but also in seeing in just having the privilege of working with lots of leaders over the last, 20 plus years, is so many times we focus on the obvious work at hand, right? Which is that business goal, that financial, incentive, whether it's salary or I've got to push my business to, break through and make this kind of revenue or whatever it is. Um, I think those are all important, right? And those are kind of like the basics of when you think about leadership is really being on the face of it successful. But what really drives me, both in the work and that I do, and I notice when I'm working with other leaders, is they leaders really have a chance to impact so many people in so many significant ways. I mean, if you were to ask anybody, think of one boss that you had that made a difference in your life, and you're going to have a story that's deeper than that boss probably ever realized, right? Because you probably didn't tell your boss, or your mentor or whatever, right? And I think that being a leader, you have an opportunity to touch so many people's lives. And how are you, what's the legacy, that you're going to leave behind in the way in which you've touched all those people's lives? Now certainly there are some people that you're going to have more of an impact than others, but you'd be surprised that sometimes, even a short period of time with somebody or even from a distance, the kind of impact that you can make.
Mm.
So that's what I really think about when I think about leadership is people impact, and the surprising ways that you are making an impact because as a leader, I guarantee you, people are watching you. They're watching you like a hawk. And so not to make you nervous, but to really be able to, maximize your impact. It's more than about the business, it's about the people. So that's what I would say.
That is brilliant. That is absolutely brilliant advice. And I think there is something to be said, Winnie, for those of us who may not even realize that we're leaders,
Yes, yes,
and just are going about our everyday lives in whatever what we think humble position or job or service we're doing. I think that understanding that I am a leader does not necessarily come naturally, even to people in leadership positions.
yeah, 100%.
Because there's always someone you're more accountable to, a board, a stakeholder,
Exactly.
whatever. And I think there's perhaps thinking in terms of legacy is might be a bit far-fetched, but thinking in terms of, as you said, people impact, like what's the impact you want people to have, um, even in contexts where you may be misjudged, which happens, which is not infrequent. You can be misjudged even as you're trying your best to do whatever. um,
100%.
I think those are the kinds of things that perhaps women may have to deal with a little bit more, reflect on it, because there's more self-consciousness there, whereas men think 30% will go for it, women are like 90% not sure, because again we're second guessing. But in that context, it's about that particular moment of interaction that you have with the person. And I hear
Yeah.
you saying that's a moment of impact, no matter what the position, what the context, what the situation. It's that moment that you've encountered someone, or you are in the process of encountering someone. And that
Yes.
moment in and of itself, regardless of the outcome, the proposition, the business, the situation, the dynamics, it's that moment of interaction that counts hugely.
Yes. And
Um,
I'll even take it a step further.
Go for it.
I will take it a step further and say maybe not always, but sometimes the biggest impact that you have is in the most difficult conversations that you have with somebody,
Mm,
right? So
mm,
a lot of times we shy away as leaders, right? Even very experienced leaders shy away from giving people real feedback and really telling them, what they kind of need to hear. And it's easy to skip over it. It's easy to say it's hard work, or they may not even, hear me, or it may not make a difference, or, it's not a big thing, it's a little thing, skip over it, right? But I'm telling you, you being able to give really good, honest, but thoughtful feedback to somebody around their blind spots, that can make a huge impact, right? Because not a lot of people are willing to stand up and say, I'm going to have the hard conversation, right? And I'm not sure how it's going to go, but I feel like this person will be a better person at the end of this conversation. That's my intent, right? My
but
intent is that.
are you saying even without being solicited, just providing that kind of input
Well,
doesn't that
I'm kind
jeopardize
of
things a
thinking
bit?
of it more as like a leader with a direct report,
Right,
right?
right.
But you bring up a good point because actually, even from a peer-to-peer standpoint, right? Even if it's unsolicited, now you have to be a little bit approach it a lot differently, because it is peer-to-peer. But anyway, I have a really big thing for feedback, and I think how powerful it can be. But certainly, as you say, if you're a leader and you've got a team, it is your responsibility, I think, to give those folks feedback, right? But anyway, I think uncovering some of those blind spots in a way, again, with the intent of helping people, can have a huge impact.
Mm. I agree in principle. I think that no, what I mean to say is that yes, it is very true. I think giving feedback, especially if you're in a position where you are responsible for
Yes.
your team and your objectives and whatever. I do think, though, that there are plenty mitigating circumstances in terms of whether people really want to hear from you or not. Because even if you're, by
Yes.
virtue of being in a leadership position, does not automatically mean that people are willing to listen to you or even
No,
take advice from you.
that's
Um,
right.
and, I know of contexts where by virtue of who you are, your race, your gender, your nationality,
Yes.
your religion can, even if you're in that position of leadership, can mean that people are less, let's say, are more resilient to listening to what you have to
Yeah.
say, and
Yes.
can actually even fight it in so
Yeah.
many different ways. They can try to come together and actually block your
Yes.
the job you're meant to do, which is to provide oversight. And I think those kinds of resistances are what I meant when I said what, conditions can be very discriminatory, that just by virtue of being in a position of leadership doesn't mean that everyone's going to be listening to you. That
No,
you might
exactly.
actually find organized resistance to
Yes.
parts of your identity, your character, what you look like. And I think
Yes.
those are the times the when the tests of leadership are particularly challenging,
Yes.
because if you're in a position of privilege and you're a woman, it's already hard enough to exercise
That's
your
right.
leadership. But if you're black, if you're of a different religion, if you come from a minority group, a whole million and one other things in this day and time means that
That's right.
you're in a position of leadership, but that does not mean you can actually exercise leadership unchallenged. On
Exactly.
contrary, you will get challenged at multiple different levels. And then the question is, well, how do you then cope without those kinds of dynamics and situations?
Yes.
And that's exercising leadership even before we've got to the point of actually it's your responsibility to give feedback. Well, if the mere exercise of your leadership is being resisted on multiple levels, we have not even got to the position where you should be giving
That's
feedback.
right. Exactly. Exactly.
So those are
And
like
you know
those are
what? And
those
you know
are
what? I've got I'll add something to this mix, which really, and I'm really glad you mentioned all of this because this really gets to some of what you're talking about.
mm,
I also believe it's the responsibility of leaders to ask for feedback.
yes, yes,
Now
yes,
that's a whole different ball game, and you still could run into everything you just mentioned. Because like why am I going to give you feedback? You know what I mean? Like what kind of trouble am I going to get into, right?
right,
So, that creates the responsibility on the leader's uh, part to really make it safe for people to give you feedback, right? To cultivate the kind of relationships, right? Where you feel like people are going to be willing to share with you, right? And that might mean you sharing where you think you fall short as a leader,
yes,
right? That's an example of making it feel safe for somebody, right? And even beyond that, right? Even before you get into exchanging feedback, hopefully as a leader, you're cultivating relationships with the people on your team to really understand them and figure out, right? To push them where they need to be pushed from a developmental standpoint, to support them where they need to be supported, right? So all that is in the background. But certainly, as a really effective leader, you're not only giving feedback like everyone sort of expects, but you're figuring out a way to get and ask for feedback in a way where you actually get it, which is not easy.
no, I think that that's a really good point. And even though I was going to try to sort of end the conversation, I really think you've
Yeah.
actually opened something very, very important. So bear with me a second.
Yeah.
I'm familiar in the coaching that I do and in the work that I do and that what I have faced myself of situations where, in spite of um, trying to create all the necessary conditions, a sense of safety, a sense of encouragement, everything else, and asking for feedback in the midst of all that, um, one of the forms of resistances that is levied against leaders who look different, are different, and different doesn't necessarily mean are bad in something, but actually may
Yeah.
be really good in something that
That's
intimidates
right.
others.
That's
One of the
right.
forms of resistance is that people will refrain from giving feedback.
Yes.
And, I mean, short of hammering them with something to say, you've got to tell me something, it actually can be very disempowering because you've created all the conditions and the context, but because by virtue of who you are,
Yeah.
um, this is actually a moment where those who feel for whatever reason um, unhappy with your leadership or just with you as a person can use this as this silence. Then no, I'm not going to, I won't give you any feedback,
Yes.
as a way of just saying, the hell with you, and with your leadership and so on. And then, you know, it's kind of hard to navigate that when it gets levied against you, because there's nothing to impose, especially on people who are in senior management positions. There's really nothing you can do beyond asking and creating the conditions and putting yourself in that really vulnerable space of saying, I really do appreciate your feedback. Here are some questions, and the questions are formed in such a way to expose vulnerability, not
Yes.
to assert dominance, but to actually expose vulnerability. And yet, in spite of that, you will still get the sullen silence, right?
Yes.
What would you then advise folks to do in contexts like this?
You know what you're really getting to, which I think is interesting, is you're getting to culture. I think you're getting into culture, right? What you're
Absolutely.
what you're pointing to is as a leader, it's because what we started out with was one-on-one relationships, right? But what you're really talking about, which I think is critical, is how do I as a leader create a culture of feedback within the company or the team or whatever sphere of influence I have, right? And I think that's the key to what you're talking about because one-off conversations, if they happen and they're successful, wonderful. Right? But feedback conversations are probably one of the most difficult conversations to have for anybody, no matter how seasoned a leader you are, right? Or no matter how much experience you have. So what you really want to do is create processes and systems where feedback comes naturally as embedded into the things that the team and the company does on a regular basis. I'll give you like a quick example of what that could be, right? So, for example, if you're having one-on-one, if you're scheduling one-on-one like let's say I'm the leader and I'm scheduling one-on-one conversations with my direct reports, right? Well, first of all, hopefully you are, right? So if you don't ever schedule one-on-one conversations, right, that's like a whole different, potential problem, right? But let's say you are, and it's like, maybe it's not every week, but it's every other week. Okay, that's great. And if you don't, and one of the things you could do if you want to create a culture of feedback is say, listen, at least one of those one-on-one feedback conversations every month. What I'd love to do is kind of have an exchange of feedback. So it just becomes something that we naturally do. It doesn't have to be like, oh, something came up. Now I have to give you feedback. It's built into what we do. And then the more we do it, the easier it is, the more natural it is. So it might take a while to get going. You might have to put more than one kind of system in process than the one I'm mentioning. That's just one out of potential for many. But then again, it creates momentum. It creates, again, you've got the processes and systems. So it's not like you have to generate it yourself. It sort of becomes part of, the water you're drinking. So that's kind of what I think of when you were talking. I don't know if that resonates.
It does resonate, and I'm so glad we've had this moment of me being on mute, because that means we proves without fail that we are on a Zoom call. Yes, it does resonate. I also think that there's room to um, consider how this kind of how these strategies, how this wisdom translates into multicultural international contexts,
Okay. Yeah.
where where even the same words in a language may be understood differently by
Yeah.
people from another part of the world, or maybe where there are multiple layers of diversity that characterize the working space. So it could
Yes.
be an American organization, but it has so many people working from different parts of the world in it. Um, and 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 or it could be all like in different parts of the world, but yet they are all Western educated. So there's some cultural elements there, but then there are some who are not from the Western. So I think that there is a part of my concern, and my curiosity about management in general is that
Yeah,
we tend to approach management, and actually the whole consultancy industry tends to see things from a particular perspective,
absolutely.
worldview, which is rooted in, even when they're based in the global south, it's still rooted in a very global north, western centric way of thinking and doing things, and it creates a certain kind of dissonance. And this is not even to go into spaces where you have situations where the consultancy industry has
Yeah,
taken over so much of what should be public
yeah,
managed knowledge and wisdom, but is now housed within specific consultancies
yeah.
and shared in specific ways. That's not even going there. I'm just talking about the multicultural contexts, which generate plenty of different layers of buts and ifs to common wisdom, shall we say, to
100%.
mainstream wisdom. But I think that that's part of what makes your work and our work in lead integrity very interesting and also relevant, is that there is no actually one blueprint of a way to do things. And indeed, as you rightly said, when you bring up the culture aspect, cultures, as there's never one culture, there's never
That's
one
right.
culture.
Absolutely.
But when you bring up the sort of cultures dimension, which by the way are rarely ever brought up, because it is always assumed that we are all culturally savvy and very savant, and even if the fact that we're multicultural per definition shows that we are very culturally competent, which is deeply problematic in my opinion. But yeah, that point of view is extraordinarily rampant. And no, but we're multicultural, therefore we are multiculturally competent. No, just because we come from different cultural provenances doesn't mean that we
Doesn't
are
mean it's
culturally
integrated
competent.
or working.
No, but I think this is where the work of the multicultural competencies comes in, and where it is perhaps one of the soft underbellies of all our kind of work, whether it's in the work of
Yeah.
consultancy and management, whether it's in the work of engineering, whether it's in the work of AI and AI
Yes.
itself and how it is put
Yes.
together and how it serves. I think multicultural competencies are so integral to our wisdom in
Yeah.
general, and yet so undervalued and
Yes.
underappreciated, or commonly assumed to be perfected. In either
Yeah.
case, we have issues, whether we are
Right.
not knowledgeable enough or whether we think we're so incredibly knowledgeable. Either way is
Yeah, right.
actually a
Either way,
problem.
there's a problem.
But there
Well,
is
and
much
I
to learn.
think the thing that you're talking about too, and I'd be curious how you talk about this, and I know we're running out of time, but like what you're talking about, part of, I mean, this is really I'm really simplifying this, but part of the solution there is making what's implicit explicit. And I think that is such a powerful way to frame things because we all have things that we assume and that are implicit that we're not making explicit. And I think that if you can frame culture and cultural differences and trying to figure out how do we create a situation where we can all do good work together, right? Because that's the goal. How can we make those implicit things explicit? Do
Mm.
you think see it the same way or
I think the question is in the how, because
okay,
there are some cultural contexts where you can't get too explicit, and you have to be
sure,
careful
exactly.
how explicit you're going to get, because
Yeah,
you might
good
actually
point.
engender a
The other
a
culture.
sense of discomfort or whatever. I think the fact is we deal with even if we're speaking the same language, um, English speaking. Let's just take English. An Australian or a New Zealander or an American or an Indian or a Brazilian or an Egyptian speaking English, we
Different.
may be using the same language, but we may be having very different understandings of what we're actually trying to say. So
That's right.
therefore, how explicit do we want to make certain things? It's not that whether we should make them explicit or not, it's how, I think.
How?
It's just
That's
like
right.
having different conversations. It's not whether you can possibly avoid them, but how are you going to have them?
That's
Right.
right.
And
That's
what
right.
is the context in which what kind of words are you going to use? What kind of questions will you, like you said, the
I
open
was
one,
just
what
gonna say,
kind
yep.
of questions are you going to ask and how are you going
That's
to
right.
ask them? I think all of that is part of the wealth of experience that I find women in particular who are well versed in so much of this, women take for granted. Like we will very rarely
I agree.
um, uh, admit, sometimes even to ourselves, let alone to one another, we will rarely admit how much we know.
Yeah. Yep.
And we
Yes.
tend to sort of just try to be more modest or whatever the word is, but we will rarely parcel out
Respond.
the things we know. We're rarely given the chance to do so. I mean, I recall being in so many different situations where just trying to explain something that I know, I've experienced, just trying to explain it will immediately engender a resistance on the person, on the part of some people listening, because they're like, why do you have to think you're not a teacher? Don't be in that professorial mode. Get out of being a teacher. I know, we know already, right? It can
Yeah.
sometimes engender that, and it's not, and I haven't said anything about them. I was just trying to explain what I understand or what I
Yeah. Yeah.
think, and put it
That's
in such
right.
a way that it would be not complicated and complex, but simple. And then immediately some people get extraordinarily upset.
Yeah.
Why do you don't have to explain things like that? You just don't, like, you think we're stupid. We don't understand what, and it's completely not what was intended,
Yeah. Right.
but also if someone else tries to do it, if a white male does
Yeah.
exactly the same thing I did, the reaction is completely different.
That's right.
Like,
That's
oh, this
right.
is really helpful.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Like, wait, what
I said the
what
same
just
thing.
happened? And
Yeah.
I think so. Those are all part of the cultures of speaking and listening that
Yes.
we can have in one family, in one
Yes.
workplace,
That's
let
right.
one social group. So those are all incredibly important things that we rarely get into, because as I was told when I was at cultural advisor in the United Nations, I was told it's not our own internal culture we need to question or to understand. We're all culturally competent. It's the culture of those people out there that we're supposed to be serving. And it was a bit like, well, if we're not
Wait a
going
minute.
to take our own cultural, if we're not going to develop an understanding of our own culture in an organization, how is it that we expect to develop an understanding of the cultures of the countries we serve in?
That's right.
How do you do that without actually first understanding what you mean by culture in your own context, in this own
That's
place
right.
that we're inhabiting? But
That's right.
that attitude is extraordinarily prevalent in everywhere, but especially when you see it in international contexts, where the whole point of being international is that you're multicultural, and therefore if you're working here, surely you know this stuff, right? We're not
That's
going to
right.
be questioning ourselves.
That's right.
Whereas in fact, that's exactly, and you said this, that we do have to begin by questioning ourselves. We do
That's
need
right.
to be a bit more self-reflexive,
That's right.
rather than assume we know it all.
That's right. That's exactly right. No, I would fully agree with you. And it takes people and a leader to model that, model that reflection, that where you can really, again, have that impact on people and the culture by living the way, you've described, that those values that bring out other people in ways that might not otherwise come out if you weren't modeling it.
Thank you so, so much, Winnie. It's such a joy talking
This
to
is
you. And
fun.
I sincerely hope we can talk off camera too, more
Yes,
often, but it's been such a enriching conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your time.
you're
And we
welcome.
might actually do this again and look more deeply into this issue of cultures of organizations and awareness, because I think we're both interested and very competent in it, but we've just begun
I know it's the
to
tip of the
unpack.
iceberg here.
Yes, yes. So I look
Well,
forward
I'm
to
definitely
more.
having you on my show too, so think about what we're going to talk about there too. But
I
yeah,
look
this was
forward to
such a
that
great
very much.
time. Thank you for
Indeed.
having
Thank
me
you
on the show.
so very, very much. And I really
Welcome.
appreciate this time and the wisdom that you've shared.